Jesus faces this crossroad moment in the Garden of Gethsemane in an important way. We've talked already about the fact that he does so with the support and the encouragement of his friends. And we've talked about the fact that Jesus does so with intense investment in earnest prayer. But we also learn something from the content of that prayer that I think we do well to pay attention to. Jesus, in the course of his praying, while he's honest and authentic about how he feels facing what he has ahead of him, Jesus also reaffirms his commitment to do God's will. We read a moment ago in verse 39, going a little farther, he fell with his face to the ground and he prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." We get this beautiful human picture of Jesus here, that Jesus really is fully human. We get this sense of, I know that what I'm facing ahead in these moments is not a pleasant thought, and that I'm gonna be receiving the judgment and the wrath of all of the world's sin in all of this. But if that's what's right, then it's your will, Lord. It's not a matter of my convenience. It's not a matter of what I want. It's what you want. It's what your will is. And we should be mindful of our need, of our readiness, of our willingness to hold such a thing as a conviction. You see, we like to use that phrase a lot. If the Lord wills, if the Lord wills this, if the Lord wants that. But sometimes when the rubber meets the road, really meaning that is a really challenging thing. That there are times when we want the Lord's will as long as that means that He's blessing what I'm really wanting to do. As long as God agrees with the course that I want to take on whatever this particular issue is. But really where the rub comes is in those moments where what you will is different than what I'd really like. And yet the call to follow Jesus is a call to say what He wants first, not what I want. It means I let go. It means I surrender of the claims that I would have on my life. In fact, there's this really interesting moment in the ministry of Jesus, and we read about it in Luke chapter 9, where a guy comes to Jesus and he says, I want to follow you. And Jesus says, but first I'd like to go do this. And Jesus says, no, you don't understand. Come follow me. Somebody else comes up and says, Lord, I'd like to follow you, but I need to do this first. And then a third time, somebody else comes up and says, Lord, I'd really like to follow you, but. And often in our lives, we think it's really cool to talk about the fact that we want to do God's will as long as it fits the conditions that we want for our lives. But Jesus didn't say, Lord, I'm willing to go to the cross, but Jesus said, I'd really, if there were any other way, I would like that. But ultimately, Lord, it's your will and not mine. Easy to read on the pages of a book. Pretty tough when we find ourselves in the midst of life and what God wills is different than what I want. In fact, just a couple weeks ago, Leanne and I were talking about some things. We were kind of processing some decisions and things in our lives. And I remember saying to her, I just wish I could do what I want. And we were kind of trying to place that in the context of the calling of God in our lives and what God's will and what God's direction is, and there was just that. I said, the human part of me, the carnal part of me just wants to say, I just want what I want. Almost like a little kid that just says, I want this. And many times in our prayers to God, we challenge Him and we cry out to Him with a sense of anger because what He wants for us, and by the way, what He wants is what is best for us, but it's not what we want. And Jesus put no conditions on that. In His humanness, Jesus says, Lord, if it would be possible, then I'd love that this cup would pass from me, but not as I will, but as you will. D.A. Carson, the author and scholar, put it far more eloquently than I could. He said in the first garden, and he's referring to the Garden of Eden, in the first garden, not your will but mine changed paradise to desert, and brought man from Eden to Gethsemane. Now, not my will, but yours, brings anguish to the man who prays it, but transforms the desert into the kingdom and brings man from Gethsemane to the gates of glory. Jesus can honestly say, not my will, but yours. I want to challenge you to search your heart this morning and to wrestle with whether or not you could say the same. In the crossroad moments of your life, are you willing to truly say to God and mean it, Lord, not my will, but yours? If it costs you something, if it hurts, if it involves sacrifice, if it involves inconvenience, if it involves giving up, are you really willing to say, not my will, but yours? Finally, after walking through these agonizing moments of prayer in the garden, Jesus, having invested himself in earnest prayer and reaffirming his commitment to do as God wills, Jesus commits to his decision. The time for action has come. We read there at the end in verses 45 and 46 that Jesus returned to his disciples and he said to them, "Are you still sleeping and resting? Look, the hour is near, and the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." Jesus presumably could see Judas and a band of men coming across the valley there toward the olive grove where the garden was. And Jesus now has settled the matter. The decision is made because ultimately it's determined by the conviction that he will do God's will no matter what. And now the time has come for action, so he rouses the disciples from their sleep and he says, let's go. It's time to move. And from that point on, the decision is made and step to action has come. As I like to say, if you stand in the crossroads, if you stand in the intersection, you get run over. It's not a good place to be. Once the decision is made, once the guidance from God has come and the conviction has determined the course of action, he commits to a decision. There's no wavering, there's no wrestling, there's no ambiguity in all of that. The decision has been made, and the cross is the step that Jesus will take. Here comes my betrayer, let's go. Get up. And we move. Time and again in Scripture, at those crossroad moments of life, God calls his people to make their decision and to live by it. We see it at a number of places. We see it in the words of Joshua to his people. You know, Joshua has taken up the baton of leadership from Moses. Moses led the people through the desert. Joshua leads the people into the promised land and in the conquest of that land. And there comes that point toward the end of the book that bears his name where Joshua is growing old and he recognizes that his time on this earth is short. And so he exhorts the people to follow God wholeheartedly, to be obedient in what they do. And then Joshua challenges them to make the right decision and to live by it, then to act on it. We read it in Joshua chapter 24, beginning at verse 14. Joshua says, "Now fear the Lord and serve him with all faithfulness. Throw away the gods your forefathers worshiped beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. But if serving the Lord seems undesirable to you, then choose for yourselves this day whom you will serve, whether the gods your forefathers served beyond the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you are living. But as for me and my household, we will serve the Lord." Joshua says, you have before you a crossroad. You have a decision. The course you choose will shape eternity. It will shape the long-term hope for your people. But choose, make that decision, and then live with it. So if you want to choose one of those other gods, then take that course. Me and my family, we're going God's way. And get on board. We see the same kind of thing in the ministry of the prophet Elijah. Elijah finds himself ministering on God's behalf, speaking for God, at a time in which God's people had made some of those choices for some of the other gods, and they chose to worship Baal, and as well as Terah and Asherah and this god and that god, and in the Lord as well. They include him in that, but if you know anything about what God has to say about that, you know that that's an unacceptable course. But Elijah describes his people's ambiguity in making a decision about who they will truly follow. And he challenges them to make that crossroad decision. We read about it there in 1 Kings chapter 18. So Ahab, he's the king, sent word throughout all Israel and assembled the prophets on Mount Carmel. And Elijah went before the people and said, "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, then follow him. But if Baal is God, then follow him." But the people said nothing. The people chose to stand in the intersection. Choose you this day whom you will serve. When we find ourselves at those crossroad moments of life, we do well to follow the example of Jesus, don't we? We do well to surround ourselves with friends who can bring us the support and the encouragement, and especially the prayer that we need in making that decision. We do well to invest ourselves in earnest, not quick, earnest, deep prayer for God's guidance and help and direction in making those decisions. We do well to reaffirm, as Jesus did, our wholehearted conviction that ultimately God's will is going to be best, no matter what the cost or the inconvenience to us. Not my will, but yours be done. And then when the decision is made, then let's step to action. Let's commit to the course that God has called us and enable him to work in the midst of those circumstances for his glory and for our good. Friends, if you haven't yet been at a crossroad in your life, you will be. That moment will come where you're faced with choosing a course. My prayer is that in those moments, you will choose the way of Jesus.